The midday sun blazed over the quiet suburban street as 17-year-old Marcus Allen walked home, his backpack slung over one shoulder. It was a routine route, one he had taken countless times. But today, a patrol car crept behind him, its shadow trailing his every step. Marcus glanced back, uneasy. The officer inside, Sergeant Tom Grayson, a seasoned cop with decades on the force, stared at him through the rearview mirror. To Grayson, Marcus looked out of place. "Hey, you. Stop right there," Grayson called out as he pulled the car to the curb. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He turned slowly, raising his hand slightly as he had been taught to do since childhood. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked cautiously. Grayson stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Got any ID?" Marcus hesitated, confused. "I live here," he said, nodding toward the row of houses ahead. "Don't get smart with me," Grayson snapped. "Empty your pockets." The confrontation escalated quickly. Despite Marcus's calm demeanor, Grayson's suspicion grew. A neighbor peeked out from behind their curtains, too afraid to intervene but curious enough to watch. Moments later, Marcus was pinned to the ground, his backpack spilled open, its contents, textbooks, a water bottle, and a cell phone, strewn across the pavement. This wasn't the first time Marcus had been stopped, and he knew it might not be the last. But this time, a passerby recorded the encounter on their phone. The video captured Marcus's pleas and Grayson's aggression spread like wildfire online, igniting outrage and calls for justice. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the case, the People versus Grayson, began. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, Marcus adjusted his tie nervously. His mother sat beside him, gripping his hand for support. Across the room, Grayson stared straight ahead, his face unreadable. This wasn't just about Marcus or Grayson anymore. It was about exposing a system that allowed such encounters to happen repeatedly. For the Allen family, the stakes were deeply personal, clearing Marcus's name and restoring his dignity. For the community, it was a chance to demand accountability and confront the biases that had long gone unchecked. As the judge entered the room, silence fell. The trial promised to be a spectacle with testimony from experts, character witnesses, and the public watching every moment. But beyond the legal drama lay a deeper question. Could this case spark real change? Marcus sat upright, his resolve steady. He had been taught to fear the system, but today he was determined to face it head-on. The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on the young man who represented more than just himself. The tension in the air was as sharp as a blade during Marcus's encounter with Sergeant Grayson. Standing under the weight of the officer's gaze, Marcus felt the familiar knot of fear tightening in his chest. He had been taught to comply, to avoid sudden movements, and to never, under any circumstances, argue. Yet, as Grayson demanded he empty his pockets, Marcus's mind raced. Why was he being singled out? Grayson's demeanor revealed a story of its own, a combination of authority and deep-seated bias. Years on the force had conditioned him to see certain patterns, but those patterns weren't rooted in evidence. They were rooted in prejudice. To Grayson, Marcus was not a teenager walking home. He was a threat, a statistic waiting to happen. "Turn out your pockets." Now, Grayson barked, his hand inching closer to his holster. Marcus obeyed, his voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong, sir." "Don't tell me what you didn't do," Grayson snapped. "Where's the stolen property?" "Stolen? What are you talking about?" Marcus's voice broke, his confusion evident. The neighbor recording the scene from their porch later testified that Marcus looked like any other kid, scared, overwhelmed, and utterly powerless. But in that moment, Marcus's innocence didn't matter. What mattered was Grayson's perception of him, a perception shaped by years of unchecked biases and systemic conditioning. This wasn't an isolated incident. Stories like Marcus's were far too common. Data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics showed that Black Americans were more than twice as likely as white Americans to experience police stops, even when no crime had been committed. Studies highlighted how implicit bias influenced officers' decisions, often leading to unnecessary escalations in situations that could have been resolved peacefully. Marcus's case echoed the stories of countless others, like Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old playing with a toy gun in a park, or Sandra Bland, whose routine traffic stop turned into a tragedy. These names and many more represented the heartbreaking reality of a justice system that often failed those it was meant to protect. But beyond the statistics were the human stories, like Marcus's, that illuminated the emotional toll of such encounters. For Marcus, the aftermath of that day was just as traumatic as the incident itself. At school, whispers followed him in the hallways. Friends avoided him, unsure of what to say. Teachers looked at him with a mix of pity and suspicion. "It's like I'm wearing this invisible mark," Marcus confided to his mother one evening. "People see me differently now, like I did something wrong just because I exist." His mother, Vanessa, struggled to find words of comfort. She had always warned her son about the dangers of being young, black, and male in America. "Keep your head down. Don't give them a reason," she had said countless times. But no amount of caution could erase the systemic issues that made her son a target. The video of Marcus's encounter, while sparking outrage, also drew backlash. Online commenters debated his innocence, dissecting his every move and questioning why he looked suspicious in the first place. The same narrative played out time and time again. The victim placed on trial, while the perpetrator's actions were excused. Grayson, too, faced scrutiny, though his experience was starkly different. Within the police department, he was seen as a good cop who had done his job. His colleagues rallied around him, emphasizing the challenges of law enforcement and the split-second decisions officers had to make. But behind closed doors, cracks in Grayson's record began to show. Complaints of excessive force and racial profiling had followed him for years, though they had always been swept under the rug. Grayson's perspective was shaped by more than just his training. It was a reflection of a system that rewarded aggression over empathy. He had grown up in a predominantly white neighborhood, where people like Marcus were often viewed as outsiders. His biases weren't just personal, they were institutional, reinforced by a culture that rarely held officers accountable. Marcus's case became a flashpoint for larger discussions about racial profiling and police reform. Advocacy groups rallied around him, demanding justice not only for Marcus, but for all victims of systemic racism. A report by the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, highlighted how stop-and-frisk policies disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities, leading to a cycle of mistrust and fear. Incidents like this are not anomalies, the report stated. They are the predictable outcomes of a system that prioritizes control over fairness. For Marcus, the weight of being a symbol was overwhelming. "I'm just a kid," he told a journalist. "I didn't ask for this." But despite his reluctance, Marcus became a voice for change, speaking out about his experience and urging others to stand up against injustice. His courage inspired many, but it also came at a cost. He faced threats, harassment, and the constant pressure to prove his worth in a world that had already judged him. The journey to the courtroom was anything but straightforward for Marcus and his family. Vanessa Allen, Marcus's mother, had always been protective, but this time, her protective instincts transformed into unshakable determination. She sought the help of civil rights attorney Gabrielle Torres, a fierce advocate known for taking on cases of police misconduct. Gabrielle's first step was to secure the video footage taken by the neighbor. It became the centerpiece of the case, a clear visual record of the injustice Marcus had endured. Yet, as she delved deeper, she discovered this wasn't just about one encounter. It was about unraveling years of unchecked behavior. "This isn't an isolated incident," Gabrielle explained to Vanessa during their first meeting. "Grayson has a history, and we're going to uncover it." Gabrielle's team worked tirelessly, combing through police records, interviewing witnesses, and compiling evidence. What they found was damning. Grayson had been the subject of multiple complaints over his 20-year career, most of which involved excessive force against Black individuals. Though none had resulted in disciplinary action, the pattern was undeniable. "This stops now," Gabrielle declared as she laid out the evidence for Marcus and Vanessa. In addition to the complaints, Gabrielle unearthed training materials that revealed systemic problems within the department. Officers were encouraged to assert dominance in encounters and were often trained with implicit biases that framed certain communities as threats. For Marcus, the legal battle was exhausting. Each deposition, each news article, and each new revelation brought a fresh wave of anxiety. "It feels like I'm fighting a giant," he told his therapist during one of their sessions. Vanessa tried to remain strong for her son, but the strain was visible. Late nights spent poring over legal documents with Gabrielle, answering calls from reporters, and trying to shield Marcus from the public eye took their toll. Still, she refused to give up. "You're not just fighting for yourself, Marcus," Vanessa told him one evening. "You're fighting for every kid who's ever been in your shoes." The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial began. Gabrielle's opening statement was succinct but powerful. "This case is not just about Marcus Allen," she said. "It's about holding accountable a system that has failed our community for far too long." The prosecution introduced the video footage early, letting the jury watch as Marcus's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Grayson's aggression. Gasps filled the room as the footage ended, leaving a heavy silence. But the most shocking moment came during Gabrielle's cross-examination of Grayson. "Sergeant Grayson," Gabrielle began, holding a stack of documents in her hand, "can you explain why there are 14 complaints against you for racial profiling?" Grayson's face reddened. "I've always acted in accordance with my training," he said defensively. "Your training?" Gabrielle asked, her voice razor sharp. She held up a department manual. "Does your training include targeting young black men for walking in their own neighborhoods?" The tension in the room was palpable. Grayson shifted uncomfortably, and the judge had to call for order as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Gabrielle wasn't alone in her fight. Community advocates rallied around Marcus, organizing protests and vigils outside the courthouse. Among them was Reverend Samuel Carter, a local pastor who had long fought for racial justice. "This isn't just about Marcus," Reverend Carter told the crowd at a rally. "This is about dismantling a system that allows this kind of injustice to happen again and again." Marcus, initially reluctant to speak at public events, found his voice during one such gathering. "I didn't ask for this fight," he said, standing before a crowd of hundreds. "But now that I'm here, I'm not backing down." His words resonated far beyond the courthouse steps, inspiring others to share their own stories of injustice. As the trial progressed, Gabrielle introduced another bombshell piece of evidence. Internal emails between Grayson and other officers laced with racist undertones and jokes at the expense of black residents. "This isn't just a bad cop," Gabrielle said in her closing arguments. "This is a reflection of a broken system." Meanwhile, Marcus's character was brought to light through testimonies from teachers, coaches, and friends. His English teacher described him as a gifted writer with dreams of becoming a journalist. His basketball coach recounted his leadership on and off the court. These testimonies painted a picture of a boy full of potential, unfairly vilified by someone who saw only a stereotype. Grayson's defense team attempted to argue that he acted out of caution, not malice, but the evidence was overwhelming. As the trial neared its conclusion, the courtroom became a microcosm of the larger societal reckoning. Jurors, spectators, and even Grayson himself were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, power, and accountability. For Marcus, the trial wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about reclaiming his voice and challenging the narrative that had been imposed on him. "I'm not who they say I am," Marcus said in a tearful testimony. "I'm not a criminal. I'm not a threat. I'm just a kid who wants to be treated like anyone else." His words left an indelible mark on everyone in the room, including Grayson, who for the first time seemed to wrestle with the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was silent as Gabrielle Torres called her final witness, Dr. Lydia Harris, a renowned psychologist and expert in implicit bias. She walked to the stand with a composed demeanor, her presence commanding attention. "Dr. Harris," Gabrielle began, "can you explain how implicit bias might influence someone's actions, even if they believe they're acting objectively?" Dr. Harris nodded. "Implicit bias operates below the surface of conscious awareness. It influences decisions, perceptions, and actions, often without the individual realizing it. For someone in a position of authority, like a police officer, These biases can have life-altering consequences for others. The jurors leaned forward, listening intently. Dr. Harris continued, outlining how stereotypes, societal conditioning, and institutional practices reinforced harmful patterns. It's not just about individual prejudice, she concluded. It's about a system that normalizes these biases, allowing them to go unchecked. Gabrielle followed up with a powerful question. In your professional opinion, could implicit bias have played a role in Sergeant Grayson's actions toward Marcus Allen? Dr. Harris didn't hesitate. Absolutely. But it wasn't just expert testimony that shifted the courtroom dynamic. Gabrielle's next move was unexpected. She called Sergeant Grayson to the stand. Grayson looked uneasy as he sat down. Gabrielle's tone was measured, almost gentle, as she began. Sergeant Grayson, she said, you've served in law enforcement for over 20 years. Is that correct? Yes, he replied cautiously. And in those years, would you say you form opinions about the communities you serve? Grayson hesitated. I suppose so. Gabrielle pressed on. In your encounter with Marcus Allen, did you assume he was involved in a crime before you had any evidence to suggest it? Grayson shifted uncomfortably. I was acting on a report of a suspicious individual, Gabrielle clarified. But nothing in that report mentioned Marcus specifically, correct? Grayson nodded reluctantly. Gabrielle paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Sergeant Grayson, when you look at Marcus now, sitting here in this courtroom, what do you see? For the first time, Grayson faltered. He looked at Marcus, who met his gaze with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. I see a kid, he said quietly. And do you think this kid, as you call him, deserved to be treated the way you treated him that day? Gabrielle's voice softened. Grayson's voice broke. No. The courtroom buzzed with emotion. Grayson's admission, while not a full acknowledgement of guilt, marked a pivotal shift. It wasn't just about one man confronting his biases. It was about a system being laid bare for all to see. The prosecution rested their case shortly after, leaving the jury to deliberate. As the trial drew to a close, the impact of Marcus's case began to ripple outward. News outlets covered the story extensively, sparking national conversations about racial profiling and police accountability. Community leaders and activists used the momentum to push for reforms, demanding better training for officers and greater oversight within the police department. In Marcus's school, the students organized a day of understanding, inviting speakers to discuss race, privilege, and empathy. Marcus, initially hesitant to participate, ended up delivering a speech that left the audience in tears. I didn't ask for any of this, he said, but if my story can help even one person see the world differently, then maybe it was worth it. Grayson's journey didn't end in the courtroom. Ordered by the court to attend counseling and implicit bias training, he began to confront the prejudices that had shaped his actions. In one session, Grayson admitted, I thought I was protecting the community, but now I realize I was hurting it. His transformation wasn't immediate or easy, but it was real. He started volunteering at a local youth center, working with kids like Marcus and hearing their stories firsthand. Slowly, he began to see the world through their eyes. For Marcus, the transformation was different. He had always been resilient, but the trial tested him in ways he never expected. Emerging on the other side, he felt a newfound sense of purpose. He started writing essays and articles about his experience, using his voice to advocate for change. The case also led to tangible changes within the police department. Under pressure from activists and community leaders, the department implemented new policies, including mandatory bias training, body camera usage, and a citizen oversight board to review complaints against officers. While these changes were significant, they weren't a panacea. This is just the beginning, Reverend Carter reminded the community during a rally. The fight for justice is ongoing. The courtroom became a symbol of transformation, not just for Marcus and Grayson, but for everyone who witnessed the case. It showed that while change was difficult, it was possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward accountability. As the jury delivered their verdict, finding Grayson guilty of misconduct but not criminal intent, the reactions were mixed. Some felt it wasn't enough, while others saw it as a step in the right direction. For Marcus, the verdict was less important than the journey. Justice isn't just about punishment, he said in an interview. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the prosecution prepared to introduce their final piece of evidence. A hush fell over the audience as Gabrielle Torres, Marcus's attorney, stood up and addressed the jury. This case is not just about one encounter, she began. It's about the truth about what happened that day, and the deeper truths about our society. Today, we'll reveal something that will make it impossible to look away. With that, she played a recording from Grayson's body camera. The footage, suppressed by the defense but subpoenaed by Gabrielle, captured the entire incident in stark detail. The grainy video played on a large screen. It showed Marcus walking along the sidewalk, his movements casual, his headphones visible. Grayson's voice crackled over the audio. "We've got a suspect in a hoodie. Looks like he's up to something." Gasps filled the room as the video continued. Marcus was polite, even cooperative, as Grayson interrogated him. But the tone of the encounter shifted when Marcus asked a simple question. "Why are you stopping me?" Grayson's response, laced with frustration, revealed more than he intended. "Because kids like you don't belong here." The recording ended, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Grayson's words echoed like a siren, their implications undeniable. Marcus sat rigidly in his seat, his hands clenched into fists. His mother, Vanessa, wiped away silent tears. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, and even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback. Gabrielle let the moment linger before addressing the jury. This is the truth Marcus faced that day, that he wasn't seen as a person, but as a threat. And that truth is bigger than this case. It's the truth so many young black men face every day. Grayson's defense attorney attempted to mitigate the damage, arguing that the officer's words were taken out of context. But the tide had turned. When Grayson himself was called back to the stand, the weight of the evidence seemed to crush him. "Sergeant Grayson," Gabrielle asked, her voice firm but calm, "can you explain what you meant by kids like you don't belong here?" Grayson's face turned pale. I don't know," he stammered. "It was a mistake. I was frustrated." Gabrielle pressed on. "Do you understand how those words reflect more than frustration? They reflect a belief, a bias that has shaped your actions." For the first time, Grayson looked directly at Marcus. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I didn't realize it then, but I see it now. I was wrong." The courtroom became a flashpoint for broader societal change. News outlets broadcast the trial nationwide, sparking heated debates about racial profiling and police accountability. Protests erupted in major cities, with activists holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus and End Racial Profiling." At Marcus's high school, students organized forums to discuss race and identity. Teachers incorporated lessons on implicit bias and systemic injustice into their curriculums. Marcus, once hesitant to speak out, became a reluctant leader. "This isn't just about me," he said during a school assembly. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." For Marcus, the journey was transformative. He found strength in his community support and discovered a passion for storytelling. He started a blog, sharing his experiences and amplifying the voices of others who faced similar struggles. Grayson's transformation was harder to accept. Ordered by the court to undergo bias training and community service, he began volunteering at a local youth center. Initially met with suspicion, he slowly earned the trust of the kids he worked with. One day, as Grayson helped a group of teens with a community cleanup project, he overheard one boy say, "I didn't think he'd stick around." Grayson looked up, meeting the boy's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. The trial's outcome spurred tangible reforms within the police department. Under public pressure, the department introduced new policies: bias training, mandatory sessions for all officers, focusing on recognizing and addressing implicit biases, community oversight, a civilian board to review complaints and increase transparency, de-escalation training, programs to teach officers how to handle situations without resorting to force. While these changes were celebrated, advocates stressed that the work was far from over. This is a marathon, not a sprint, Reverend Carter reminded the crowd at a rally. The courtroom, once a place of tension and division, became a symbol of transformation. For Marcus, it represented reclaiming his dignity and agency. For Grayson, it marked the beginning of accountability. As the trial concluded, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. When asked what he hoped people would take away from his story, he said simply that change is possible. But it starts with listening. His words resonated far beyond the courthouse steps, inspiring a wave of reflection and action in communities across the nation. The verdict was in, and while it sparked mixed reactions, its impact was undeniable. For Marcus Allen, Sergeant Grayson, and the broader community, the case had become a turning point, a moment that illuminated painful truths and set the stage for change. As Marcus and his mother left the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, a sense of quiet determination replaced the anger and fear they had carried for so long. "This isn't the end," Vanessa told a journalist. "It's just the beginning of something bigger." In the months following the trial, Marcus's life took on a new rhythm. At first, he struggled to return to normalcy. The spotlight, while necessary for justice, had been exhausting. But through therapy and the unwavering support of his family and friends, he found strength in his story. Marcus channeled his experience into activism. He began visiting schools, community centers, and youth organizations, sharing his story and encouraging young people to stand up for themselves and others. His blog gained traction with posts that blended personal anecdotes, reflections on justice, and calls for action. One post, titled "More Than a Statistic," resonated deeply. "I'm not just a kid in a hoodie. I'm not just a name in a headline. I'm someone who dreams, loves, and hurts, just like you. If my story has taught me anything, it's that change starts when we see each other as human." Marcus also started a scholarship fund, supported by donations from community members and organizations inspired by his resilience. The fund, named after his late father, aimed to help Black youth pursue education and leadership opportunities. For Sergeant Grayson, the aftermath of the trial was marked by introspection and accountability. The court-mandated bias training sessions were uncomfortable at first. Grayson found himself confronting aspects of his own identity and upbringing that he had never questioned. In one session, a facilitator asked, "When did you first learn to fear someone who looks like Marcus?" Grayson couldn't answer right away. The question haunted him, leading to conversations with his wife, his children, and even his colleagues. Grayson's work at the youth center became a cornerstone of his transformation. At first, the kids were wary of him, seeing only the badge and the uniform. But over time, as he listened to their stories and shared his own, a fragile trust began to build. One day, Marcus visited the center to speak with the kids. Seeing Grayson there, Marcus hesitated. But as the two exchanged a brief nod of understanding, it became clear that both were committed to change, however imperfect and ongoing that journey might be. The trial sparked a wave of local activism. Town hall meetings, once sparsely attended, became standing room-only events. Community leaders worked with the police department to create new initiatives aimed at rebuilding trust. Youth engagement programs, designed to foster positive relationships between officers and young people. Transparency measures, including public access to data on stops, searches, and complaints. Independent oversight, a citizen-led board with the authority to review police conduct and recommend disciplinary actions. These changes didn't come without resistance. Some officers felt unfairly scrutinized, while others embraced the reforms as a long-overdue step toward accountability. Reverend Carter, who had been a vocal advocate throughout the trial, reminded the community, "This is progress, but it's not perfection. Real change takes time, and all of us." The case drew national attention, becoming a catalyst for conversations about racial profiling and police reform. Advocacy groups used Marcus's story as a rallying cry, pushing for legislation at the state and federal levels to address systemic bias in law enforcement. Marcus was invited to speak at a congressional hearing on police accountability. Standing before lawmakers, he said, What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that needs fixing. I'm here today because I believe we can do better, not just for me, but for everyone who feels unseen, unheard, or unsafe. His words echoed in the chambers, sparking bipartisan discussions about meaningful reform. Years later, Marcus returned to the courthouse for a panel discussion on justice and reconciliation. Now a college graduate and an aspiring journalist, he reflected on how the trial had shaped his life. It's not about forgiveness, he said. It's about accountability. It's about making sure that when we say, never again, we mean it. Grayson, now retired, sat in the audience. Though their paths rarely crossed, he had followed Marcus's journey with a mix of pride and regret. He knew his actions had caused pain, but he also saw how they had propelled Marcus to become a force for change. The story of Marcus and Grayson became a case study in police academies and social justice seminars. It highlighted the complexities of bias, the power of resilience, and the potential for growth, even in the face of profound injustice. As the panel discussion ended, Marcus left the audience with a challenge. We've come a long way, but the work isn't done. Look around you. Ask yourself what role you can play in building a world where stories like mine don't have to happen. And then act. The audience rose in applause, inspired not just by Marcus's words, but by the journey that had brought them there. Outside the courthouse, a mural depicted Marcus walking with his head held high, his shadow intertwining with a community of people marching together. Above them, bold letters read, "Justice is a journey." The image captured the essence of the story, a reminder that while the road to equality and understanding is long, every step forward matters.